you, well, we'll just talk about the most recent updated estimates for the county, and Huda's gonna describe that just for a minute. And then we'll move on to the county forecast and then the particular UGB forecast.
I have a question.
Yeah, sorry, yeah.
When you made your estimates, did you consider how much undeveloped land were in the city's UGBs and the zoning of that?
So we do not take into account the amount of undeveloped land that is going in there, and that's by design. We are trying to figure out if, given the current population trends that are happening within an area, that the current UGB boundary has enough to account for it, and if there is undeveloped lands within the area, then we're not necessarily saying that like, okay, we expect them to infill it, and if there's not, like the instance for North Plains, we don't want to have an artificial like lowering of a forecast just because we know that like there isn't a whole lot of room for them to grow. The design of the project is supposed to be, given that we've seen the population projections go in this way, the population trends in this way, is there justification for expanding the UGB boundary, right?
And that works as long as the zoning and housing keeps pace with the population growth. If it doesn't, it can create a negative feedback loop. But if we try to base the forecasts on the available land, there would be circular logic because the land decisions are supposed to be made based on
Right.
the future population growth potential.
So, not to derail the meeting.
No, totally.
I'm the city attorney for a number of jurisdictions, most of which are, one which is within Metro, but most of which are Metro adjacent.
Okay.
And in my experience has been, if the city had land that was available and it was zoned low density residential, that those, and they were Metro adjacent cities, those cities over from between 2010 and 2020 had explosive population growth. And it's so like Happy Valley had huge population growth and it continues to some extent, but then once the price of housing reached a certain point in Happy Valley, then Estacada had huge population growth. And I think that, I mean, I think that trend is continuing correctly. That if, as soon as land comes into the UGB, it develops, if the zoning and infrastructure is there.
Yeah, if you build it, they will come sort of idea.
Well, and you'll see that when we get into Estacada, how our forecasts actually have grown over time. But I think that the issue you're talking about too, with the explosive population growth, housing supply not keeping pace, the problem is the forecast program was only ever designed to measure from this point forward how much housing we need, and the housing needs analyses were always designed for that too. So I think that you know, this is an issue I care a lot about, and the LCD cares a lot about too. And I think that they've taken a leadership role in getting the changes in the housing needs assessments in the recent legislation to allow to consider historic production and future production plans. So it's not only forward-looking how much future population growth, but you can also say over the past 10 years, housing was not built at a pace which kept pace with population growth, and therefore the housing targets should be higher in order to maintain housing affordability. But you're right, that it's a little bit beyond what our role in the housing needs analyses is. I think the DAS and the LCD are more the sources for what has the historic underproduction been, and so how cities can incorporate that.
Yeah, and I want to be clear, yeah, where that is the process too. I know at the end of the day, people are very concerned with the bottom line number of like what's going on, but we try to include that information in the reports where it's presented to us, and we're acutely aware of like where that's happening within a particular UGB or in a county. And again, that's where the responses like come in, and like when we get a better idea of like reference this HNA that like we can go to, and to like also include that information in our forecast reports as well, that we're explicit that this is based predominantly on like the population trends and doesn't reflect a historic underproduction, and include that in the report as well. Yeah. Okay. Happy to take any more questions too from people online. Feel free to interject at any time. Happy to answer questions. Totally don't mind being derailed or anything. What's that? Or add questions in chat as well. Yeah, totally. I saw this is just someone who said they'll be back. Yep. Oh. was another question.
Yes, the
Yeah,
recording, yeah, I can monitor those for you. The recording and slide deck will be made available. I think our plan was to embed the slides in the recording, so it'll be kind of alongside. But we may be able to post the PDF for the slides as well.
Oh, yeah, definitely. We'll have the slides as well as all of these numbers. The official numbers will be, you know, these proposal numbers will be posted next week. Yep. So, yeah, recordings, slides, numbers will be there. Yep, no problem. All right.
Okay, so now we can see the most recent estimate cycle, results from the most recent estimate cycle, which is 23 cycle. Here you can see this in the green bar. And as I just mentioned in the overview, each new cycle, we go back and revise the previous year. So you can see for the 21 and 22, you can see also the dashed line. Maybe there is difference here because we received more data for those years. Then we go back and revise those years. Regarding the results from the 23, as we can see, since the 2020, the year of 2020, the population growth for Clackamas County and even for most counties in Oregon is basically because of the net migration. It is positive, that means there will be growing in the population. This is because the natural change is decreasing because number of deaths exceeds number of births for most of counties. And you can see here, there is a drop in the population between 20 and 21 during the pandemic time. And this is because both of them, natural change was decreasing and also net migration was decreasing. But starting of 22 and 23, after that, the population is growing again. All during the time between the 2020 census and July 1st, 23, the Clackamas County population increased from 421K to 424K. And now I will hand over to Neil to continue.
So we're gonna take a zoom out now for the forecast and look at a longer time series of the county population and our new set of forecast for Clackamas. So this is now showing a graph going back to 1970 and the population forecast there. In 1970, right, the population was about 166,000, and we've seen it increase quite substantially over time, but this general trend of like slowing growth as the county has gotten bigger. And between 2010 and 2020, the county grew by about 12%, right? Our growing from 376,000 to 422,000 in the population. Moving forward, again, we see slower growth than what we had forecasted last time. Our last forecasts are shown in the dotted line, and our new forecasts are to the right of the horizontal line, the new set of forecasts, right? And we're about 20%, 30% lower in terms of the total growth, right? Not the 50% drop that we saw at the US level that the US Census Bureau had, but still substantially lower than what we had last time in terms of total population growth, where it's a similar level by 2030 forecast, but the differences really start to show by 2050. So what's driving this, right? It isn't predominantly net migrants, right? I think that when we look at Clackamas County, our migration estimates for the county are pretty optimistic. They have a number up of about 4,000 individuals migrating into the county a year. And that's pretty up there compared to like what we've seen with the past, right? Instead, this population slowing down in growth is really coming from differences in natural change. People are having less kids than they were before. We have an older age population, and we are seeing more deaths in the county that we observed in the past, right? And so that's what's reflected here in our birth projections, right? Our birth projections show this like slowing down in the total number of births that's happening beginning in, going back to 2000 and just reflected moving forward, and it to stabilize at some point in the later time periods. But this decline in births that's happening, that's really having an impact in combination with this increase in deaths. And so I mentioned earlier that life expectancy is increasing, that we are seeing differences in life expectancy that are more optimistic. However, we've seen this general increase in mortality, and again, to the left of that vertical line is the is the past data pulled from death records, and to the right is our forecast, and we are expecting an increase in the number of deaths. Mostly as the boomer age population cohort ages beyond 65 plus, and that large portion of Oregon, has higher mortality rates, right? Again, this isn't necessarily to say poor life expectancy. We're expecting increases in life expectancy. A lot of this population is going to live substantially longer than what we've observed in the past. But aging nonetheless happening within the county. Fertility rates are where it's really declining. In both these graphs, I'm showing the comparison between the county and Oregon. And for Clackamas, it's had better than average life expectancy, but on par fertility rates. The number of kids that are being had within Clackamas County is similar in Oregon than it is compared to Clackamas County, but that's been declining over time since the 1990s, and we expect it to decline moving forward. This is going to impact population aging. So on the top and two sections, I have population pyramids from 1990 and 2020, where we see that we had a very young population within the county in 1990, as reflected by a bulk of the graph, being at the bottom portion of that pyramid. But by 2020, that starts to flatten out and it's more even in its distribution over time. As we move forward in the forecast, we expect most of the population to be now in these older age groups as large portions of the population continue to age over time within the county. In terms of race and ethnicity and how that's impacting our forecasts, a lot of the population growth within Clackamas is happening within the Asian Pacific Islander, as well as Hispanic populations within the county. White population growth is also contributing to population increase within the county, albeit at a slightly slower level than those other two populations. At this point, I'm going to transition over to the UGB portions of the graph. And please, again, if there's any particular city or UGB forecast that you want me to stop for, I think this is probably the portion where people are going to want to talk most. So I'm happy to stop and talk about like the decision making what we had for any one of these forecasts. And the general overview is going to be similar for each of these, where the first one is we show a comparison between the UGB and city boundaries. So at a location like Barlow, there's complete overlap. The city boundary is the same as the UGB boundary here. So there's no expansion that's going to be happening within the city boundaries that's going to allow for more housing to be developed within the UGB, right? So complete overlap here, and again, that's not the case for all city UGB areas. Barlow had a population of 133 as of the last 2020 census, and 42 housing units. These are both declines from what we saw in the previous census. 100% employment rate, and an age 65 plus that is much lower than the state average, which is hovering around 18.5%. So a relatively younger population in this area, and a little bit higher than average non-white population then.
Hey, Neil.
Yeah.
This is Dennis.
Hey, yeah.
I was wondering, what do you mean by employment rate, 100%? What's that?
So those are, and the employment rate is this among those people participating actively in the labor force that is currently like seeking employment or would be seeking employment, how many of them are employed? And that number comes from the American Community Survey. And it basically just means out of everyone that we've interviewed in this area on average over the past 5 years, everyone who said that they are participating in the labor force is currently employed.
So this is like the flip of the unemployment rate then?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So for a population of 133, like you're gonna
everyone's
get pretty
employed.
high employment rates for some of them. It's never going to be 100% in larger areas, right? But for Barlow, it is a feasible thing for the employment rate to be there. Yeah, but that high.
Sorry to interrupt.
Okay.
I just never really saw that.
Saw 100% employment rate, sure.
Well, it's not something that you think about, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sample though, so there will
Right.
be statistical uncertainty, which is not shown here.
Yeah. Again, population and housing dynamics, like I just mentioned, declines in Barlow's UGB, both in terms of housing unit over the last 10 years, as well as in the total population. And this continued moving forward, so this is a place where we're expecting lower population growth. Although I will note for these like smaller UGB areas where populations are under, 500, it's a little bit harder to say in the direction where things are going. Current set of forecasts have this really reflecting that like population decline that we've observed over the past 30 years, compounding with the fact that populations are aging over time. And another graph that we're going to show is growth rate comparisons. So there's 4 lines here reflecting the UGB growth, which is the Barlow's growth rate against the county. So how does it compare against the county? How does it compare against Region 3, all counties in the area, as well as the US forecasted total population rate as well. Moving on to Canby. Canby has a pretty sizable difference between the city boundary and the UGB boundary. So I want to make sure that when we're talking about development, we're talking about development for the UGB boundary and not the city boundary. Again, population much larger here, about 18,000, and a growth rate of 14% over the decade, with 6,800 housing units and a persons per household of about 2.7, which is around a little bit higher than the state average, but around the state average. Employment rate relatively high of 97%, and household income of about 91,000. Age 65 plus is about 18.44%, which again, and non-white population about 24%, close to hovering around the state average. So we have these like indicators of generally positive population increase over time, and that's reflected in our forecast as well. We're expecting Canby to continue to grow inside, albeit slower than the last time we've made these forecasts. Again, taking into account these new dynamics that we weren't observing before, we've adjusted these downwards a little bit, but continue to see on average about 8% growth rate on average in the forecast period moving forward for the Canby UGB area. Currently, population as of 2020 of 18.6 thousand. We expect that to increase by 2040 to 23,000 and 25,000 by 2050. Relative to some other UGBs, the difference between the last time we made these forecasts and this time is a bit smaller, and that's indicated by these like positive indicators of population growth that we've observed both in housing and the population, slightly younger population in those regards. Again, growth rate comparison relative to Clackamas County, Canby has grown on average faster than the county and faster than the rest of the other counties within the region. And so we're expecting it to grow quicker than the county or most other locations on average. Estacada. Estacada, again, pretty big difference between the city and UGB boundary, albeit a lot of that area is not prime for housing or population development necessarily, as indicated by the location of that airport there on this map. Nevertheless, differences between the city and UGB boundary. Population grew tremendously since 2010 to 2020, 61.63% increase, with a number of new housing units. Occupancy rate relatively high of about 95.48% with 2.7 persons per household in that area. Pretty high unemployment rate of 94%, with a household income that's a little bit less than the rest of the county at 78,000. And a non-white population that's a bit less than the rest of the county, but an age 65 plus that is lower than not just the county but also the state, indicating that we have a bit younger population here.
So is that population number, was that your estimate or was that the census?
That was from the census estimate. So this is directly coming from the 2020 census. In the next slide, I'll show the UGB estimate, and you'll notice it's a little bit different than the population, than that population estimate. So these are the UGB estimates for the area. So the city is at 4,356. The UGB is at 5,000, right? And that's because the UGB encompasses a little bit bigger population than the city. They, Census Bureau provides city statistics. They don't provide anything at the geographic scale of UGB. That's a unique thing that we use within the state. So These data sources, I should have said earlier, thank you for reminding me, that are for the city. And these ones are for the UGB, so you'll see slight number differences between those two. And this big population increase, you know, that we saw between 2010 and 2020 in the UGB area, going up from 3.3 thousand up to 5,000 in the UGB area. And though we've seen big increases in the housing production, that housing production isn't as fast as the population growth that is moving forward, you know, and that led us to a bit of concern when we made the population forecast last time. Although since we made the population forecast last time at the proposal set, we had received a couple of survey responses that let us know that actually housing production is really up in Estacada and is looking to keep up with this population growth. So we've adjusted it upwards a little bit from the last time that we presented these forecasts in November. And also is an upward adjustment from the last time we made these forecasts in 2020 as well.
Cause we're seeing application after application.
Yeah,
And in fact, you know, for large scale, like, planned unit developments and subdivisions and.
yep. Yeah, I did have to, so I noted that in our original set that the number of contracts that Estacada had already for housing units and housing units that are already underdeveloped, our number didn't reflect that well, so we had to adjust this, so this is the higher portion that's like that's pushing up. And that, like, yeah, a lot of low housing stock right now that's currently being worked on, and these influx of young families who have been moving, presumably from the metro area, who are now, as you had mentioned before, coming into Estacada because it's a bit more housing affordable, that's in the area. And actually, for our forecast, Estacada is the fastest growing UGB that we're making forecast for. Right now, we don't have that, like, you know, we saw 50% growth between 2010 and 2020. We would be very surprised if that continued to maintain. But we nonetheless expect higher than average growth in the area. And I think that's like really reflected here in this graph, as well as the difference between the county and the region and the US in total is just like, is much higher for Estacada than other locations, you know? So this is a forecast period as well, and we expect during this 10-year period between 2020 and 2030 of about like 40% growth, and for that to cool off a little bit over time as we like move forward. And you know, we might be wrong in that longer term projection, but again, I feel we've calibrated this against other city forecasts, other forecasts that were made at city level as well. That have incorporated for Estacada. So I mentioned that publications that we had read as well that made city level forecasts, and this aligns with their highest level of population growth for Estacada. Granted, they don't take into account the number of new housing units that are happening into the area, and we do. That's why we feel more comfortable with having a really high growth trajectory as our like baseline for Estacada compared to other cities.
Stay, Neil, this is Dennis.
Yeah,
So this forecast for Estacada doesn't, I heard you say right up front that when you're doing these forecasts, you don't account for capacity, vacant land and redevelopment capacity.
correct.
Okay. So this, because I was going to say, it probably, since you're going out to 2070 on this, that you probably exhaust the
Oh,
current
yeah,
20-year
definitely.
supply.
Yeah,
Okay.
and right, and that's again by design, because we want to use these forecasts again to ensure that like is the current stock enough in order to accommodate population
Mhm.
growth, right? We don't
Yeah.
want to artificially decline these populations because like the whole point, I think, is like, do we need to expand the UGB, think about housing differently, given that this is the population trend? And that works great, again, for cities and UGBs who haven't hit that upper threshold and ran into that issue before. Yeah.
And it
And
might be a little easier to do this forecast, given that you don't have to worry about capacity and redevelopment.
yeah, and that isn't to say that we don't take into account like other external factors that slow down population growth. It's just not the housing stock or the current growth boundary restricting that, you know. You'll see later when we talk about, and if you're already on the call for Sandy UGB, who is restricted for other reasons, we do make an adjustment there, albeit a temporary adjustment.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Dennis, I mean, you're probably not paying too close of attention to Cicada, but we have a large amount of land in the UGB. And what's been happening is, it's almost as soon as urban services are available, then we get the next application. And so we have an application right now for a downtown redevelopment project, apartments. Not far enough along to be counted for us to turn it over to you, but
Yeah.
but we are seeing multifamily, some multifamily as well, but primarily it's been single family houses that are priced between $400,000 and $750,000.
yeah, and.
I think the the dynamics of the economics makes a lot of sense. So thanks for that comment. By the way, just out of curiosity, when you have available capacity, how long does it take for you to get it up to urban service production level? Like here in the Metro UGB, I could cite examples of 20 years for land that's been brought into the UGB here at Metro UGB before it ever gets touched. So I'm just wondering,
Right.
are you guys more effective, efficient in
No, I was the city attorney that surrendered the charter for Damascus. So I've spent a lot of time on comprehensive plans and such. What I have found is, as soon as the urban services are available, and there's some times where this isn't true. I mean, there's sometimes like a farmer that just isn't going to sell. But as soon as you have water and sewer capacity to the property, it's going. And the question just becomes the cost of the dirt, the cost of the SDCs, and then if it pencils, it's developing. And so we will develop in Estacada, I believe, until we run out of capacity. And that, to give another thing that I've been working on, so like the Salt Creek and Tualatin, like the portions of that are zoned housing are developing immediately. I mean, just the amount of, I drove by that and the amount of units that have gone in, I don't know how many, but I'm sure you've got that data. But yeah, as soon as it got zoned, it developed.
What's the topography like on the land capacity there right now?
In Estacada.
Yeah, the seeing all the activity.
It is, we do have some steeper slopes, but we have a lot of flat land, and actually we're seeing a lot of housing around the airport. So that hasn't been and that's a privately owned public use airport. But yeah, literally it's like when they get the water and the sewer, it develops.
Martha, I saw that you had a question as well. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Well, it was actually more of a comment.
Okay.
I think that, Dennis, I think the whole Estacada situation right now really is economics, sort of the right place, the right time, and the right price, because that urban growth boundary has been that size since like the 80s. I'm not sure exactly what date. There's only been really minor expansions that are related more to employment lands. So it's not as if they did this big expansion and suddenly everything is going. It's just that they've had this land sitting there in the UGB for a really long time, and all the pieces have fallen together, I think, in the last decade. So I don't know if it's,
yeah, that's
I don't
what
know
I
if
was
it's
thinking.
something that's like that is really totally applicable to the Metro UGB, if that's what you were trying to sort of get at.
Well, I was just trying to think that it takes time to bring land into, even when it's in the UGB. You've got your Damascus thing, right? And Tualatin and Wilsonville has had that area between, and that got brought in 2000, early 2000. I can't remember the year exactly.
Yeah, but it
It's
didn't
taken
get
a while.
zoned until, the Salt Creek didn't get zoned until September of this year, so.
You're
even-
right. It took a long time
Yes,
for that to happen, but it also took a long time. So whether it's infrastructure or governance by way of entitlement, it just seems like it takes a long time, and
Yeah,
it
in
just
terms of
for
the.
whatever reason.
In terms
And I
of,
thought maybe you guys had the secret sauce. Estacada had the secret sauce to move ahead very quickly. But Martha, thank you for the history on Estacada. You're right. I haven't looked at Estacada very much, so I'll admit ignorance there, which is why I'm asking.
no, I'm glad that y'all brought this up too, and thank you, Martha, for mentioning that, because in terms of like typologies of smaller UGBs that then experience like population growth, it does seem, there is this like spark effect, and it's like, okay, it's hard to predict who's gonna get that spark exactly when, but like once we see it initiated, we like try to take into account, okay, this is probably going to sustain for some time and then slow down, you know, like that explosive growth is not sustainable for 40, 50 years, is not going to happen for many locations in that regard. But we do want to sustain it, you know, and think about it and look at other city models that we have in terms of like what has growth looked like for those locations, you know, going back to like 1970 or something, trying to use other cities' growth to inform what our future growth might look like for these new explosive growth locations.
Yeah, I can see that in your 2030 number. You have it zipping up to 36%, but then in subsequent decades it tapers to it. And it might actually, as you pointed out, I think in your preface, that this might actually be too big in later years without additional capacity.
Right, yeah, and it might be too small, but this is, given that we're going to update again in 4 years, I think this is a very feasible and realistic and good set as like a baseline projection. For the sake of time, I just want to keep moving forward just to the next ones and everything, yeah. Schools have improved immensely in the past 5, 6 years, do appreciate that, thank you, yeah. And yeah, I'll have this text saved. That's an excellent point, and I do want to make sure that I record that and that we have that included as well and talk about that in the report. And again, just growth much higher than what we've seen in other locations. Malala, comparison between the UGB and the cities, shown here. Again, population of about 10,000. A big increase from 2010, 26% increase, larger than average. High occupancy rate, household income, pretty similar to Estacada, but again, a population again that is like pretty young, and has seen growth over time, slower housing growth for Malala that's happening in this area. And I did get some notes again from the surveys, and I appreciate y'all for submitting this as well about the kind of growth that's happening. Y'all had mentioned that multifamily units are infilling for single family residences within the area, that there's a lot of demographic shifts that are happening, but there is a you all have talked about yourselves actually a current slow projected population growth. In part because of lack of housing development again hasn't kept on pace at the same degree to population growth. We still expect Malala to grow over time, but again at a little bit slower rate, than what we saw last time. And this is a location that is more impacted by the decreases that we've seen over time. There's a couple of reasons for this. As city UGB areas get larger, it's harder to grow, and we see more slowdowns in the growth over time, as well as the aging dynamics start to impact a location as well. But generally, you know, large population growth is a decent sized population growth is expected to occur, even if it's not to the same degree that we had seen before. And I think that's again reflected here for Malala, is that historically been above average in terms of its population growth over time. And we continue to expect to see that growth outpacing the cities or the city surrounding locations, as well as the region, as well, you know, as the US there as a baseline comparison, even if it's not as fast as it's historically been. for the area. Did see a comment coming up. Oh, just a link for that. Thank you.
So I think we'll allow us down to like 30 or 40 net developable residential acres. So their future population growth will probably be predicated on,
Yeah.
yeah.
No, totally. And that, so normally, again, we don't take that into account explicitly, but that's an area where the slower housing development in more recent years has impacted it to some degree. And so this slowing in population growth that tends to affect a bit larger, right? Malala is a little bit bigger than Estacada. And so you see that drop here. Nonetheless, still a outlier and above average in terms of like population growth for the area. Sandy, UGB, versus the city, the population here, again, growing tremendously by 31%. In the area, high persons per household, high employment rate, relatively high household income, even relative to the rest of the county, young population, and we have seen really large growth, over the, yep, of course, Tony, over the past 30 years. Interesting dynamic here where we have seen large growth, but we expect that growth to be slower in the next 10 years. We toned it down even since November. We talked it, we had a more optimistic outlook in November. But again, in your survey responses, you made it quite clear to us that a big concern was the fact that there is a moratorium on new housing units and new housings connected to the sewer line that is going on for at least a year, is going to impact development to some degree. We have an optimistic bounce back for this, where we expect the county to grow more quickly after that, but the initial run, we expect Sandy to be impacted by that in the next 10-year period before it bounces back and sees sort of that kind of growth that is more reminiscent of like the past 20 to 30 years. And again, this is a infrastructure that, you know, people have known that it's going to need to be updated for some time. It's just that like people have kept connecting to the sewer line for a long period of time. And so again, thank you for letting us know the city saw it necessary to initiate this moratorium on new units connecting to the line in that case. Growth rate comparison, again, you see it dropping below the county and region average in the next 10-year period as that moratorium like really hits, but then bouncing back to above average for the area.